All right, so off we go into Russia. Russia long been a place of political backwardness and cultural backwardness, and even though we're in the post-Soviet era, we still see a lot of that backwardness in the way things are done today. First off, Constitution that's currently in effect is that came about in 1993 after the fall of the Soviet Union. And this basically combines a presidential and parliamentary system. And with that said, everything that we talk about with Russia has to be deciphered in the context of Vladimir Putin, because on paper we have a democratic system with a presidential regime and a parliamentary regime mixture, but at the same time we do have this managed democracy idea. Putin is the man in charge. He rules like a dictator effectively, but he'll go through the democratic channels. On paper the system looks democratic, but Putin has worked hard to limit that democracy, to have his hands on that democracy. And so, therefore, he has ways, he has trapdoors of getting through the democratic limitations that are typical in a liberal democracy, where he can control the coercive channels of the state in order to get his stuff done. So here's your first example of Putin kind of putting an asterisk next to all the things that we see. Now, they're supposed to be structurally, but in reality, in function, Putin puts his own spin on things. Russia has a semi-presidential system, which is to say elements of both a presidential and a parliamentary regime, but it's also flavored with a lot of strong state socialist tendencies. So lots of regulations and bordering on what we call a police state, where the authority through the president and his channels have a lot of authority, and we see some limitations on the democratic process. The economic system in Russia is a mixed system with a free market framework. Again, on paper it's a free market, but lots of state regulatory power, which would suggest elements of socialism, but not necessarily in order to create a welfare state like you see in Europe, more to create an authoritative central government. Legitimacy and stability, and we go to Russia for the first time, we can see these ideas kind of in flux. And so Russia has been in upheaval since 1991. It's relatively stable now, but there's been lots of highs and lows since the days of the fall of the communist system. And because Putin has restored some of that stability, this is why he is one reason he's able to get himself elected frequently, although in the last election he did face a little more opposition. But Russia, ever since the Russian Revolution in 1917, has been very much a place with highs and lows of stability, where you've got satellite states trying to break from the Soviet Union to revolution phases all throughout the Soviet period. Right now, relatively stable, but there could very well be days ahead where that is threatened. In terms of legitimacy, Putin kind of writes the book as he goes and gives himself the legitimacy, but the manner at which he gains his own power is definitely questionable in terms of legitimacy. But on the international stage, Russia, clearly a legitimate country recognized by everybody. Levels of government, another example of what's on paper is not necessarily what happens in real life. Russia has a federal system, but Putin has worked to make things much more unitary, which you could say that for a lot of federal systems like that in the United States. The reason we have a federal system in Russia is because many regions are ethnic-based, while others are administrative. We have lots of these different units inside the borders of the Russian country. As of 2007, 85 autonomous regions. And so these ethnic-based republics, you have autonomous districts and you have these provinces, But the way you look at this is that these are effectively countries inside of Russia, where there's so many varying ethnic and cultural differences in these places that they've, for a long time, even in the Soviet days, to a degree, have been given control over their own affairs, and it kind of winds up to where you have these little mini countries inside. You also have these political units, these provinces, territories, federal cities, where they kind of have local governance as well, all with Putin kind of watching in the background to try to figure out ways to control them as well. These ethnic republics, though, they have their own presidents, who kind of become like dictators in their own land, and they're in constant competition with Putin. And so for all these reasons, Putin is a guy who wants to be the man. He wants to be in charge. He's not going to stand for these presidents of these ethnic republics. And so what he has done is try to reassert federal power by merging the ethnic republics or other political unions so that there are fewer of them, by appointing his own czars or federal representatives to monitor regional governments. In other words, he's going to tell these little mini presidents, go ahead and do your thing, but my guys are going to be there watching, putting pressure on you. And also abolishing the elections altogether and appointing his own regional parliaments for his approval, and all kinds of little things here and there in the shadows that Putin is doing to increase his influence on these different levels of government. The presidency is elected to a maximum of 2 6-year terms starting in 2012, and this effectively is at the behest of Putin, which beginning in 2012 basically gave himself a 12-year term, so he doesn't have to worry about playing the little games he had to play before. For example, he was president and he termed out, and then he switched over to prime minister, termed out there, and then they just said, why don't we just change the Constitution so I can be president again? 2 long 6-year terms. We don't have to worry about this until 2024. But the president currently is the power holder in the government. When Putin was prime minister, it was the prime minister who had all the power. But the president controls the offices of coercion, or the power ministries, state police, which is called the FSB, the old KGB, defense, intelligence, internal affairs. All of these things are in direct control by the president, which allows him to be more of this aggressive, borderline dictatorial executive. He can also issue his own presidential decrees. The prime minister, on the other hand, is the head of government, but currently this person kind of is at the pleasure of the president, and he is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Duma, and as long as the president is happy with you being his puppet, then you can have this cool title as prime minister and rubber stamp all the things through the cabinet and the legislature. The Security Council is made up of the president, the prime minister, the heads of the power ministries, and the chairs of the legislature, and they formulate foreign and defense policies, which if you're paying attention recently to Russian affairs, you'll see that they are quite busy in and around the areas of Syria and Georgia and Ukraine. The Soviet Union has been quite busy trying to reassert itself in Asia and in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and to the point where one wonders if they are trying to become the dominant player in the world again, along with the United States. The legislature altogether is known as the Federal Assembly. It is bicameral. The lower house is called the Duma, and bills originate here. And then, like in most bicameral systems, when passed, it goes to the upper house, which is the Federation Council, which can also pass the bills, reject them, call for an agreement commission. Pretty standard bicameral processes. If the Duma dislikes the changes that the Federation Council makes, it can override them with a 2/3 vote and send the bill to the president. The president can sign the bill, return to the Duma with amendments, which is something that the American president can't necessarily do. It's either a yes or no for him. The Duma rarely overrides the president for obvious reasons. You're not going to go against Putin. But it often overrides the Federation Council. The Federation Council also confirms presidential appointments to the courts, presidential decrees, treaties, declarations of war, common things that an upper house like the U.S. Senate would do. The electoral system in Russia is where we really see its uniqueness. The president is elected through a majority runoff system. And so in this case, we have many candidates. As soon as somebody gets 50%, then they win. Now, that can happen in the first round of voting. And if they do get 50%, one person does, then they automatically become the president. If not, then the top two go to the runoff, and then somebody has to get 50% at that point. Putin easily elected in recent elections. The Duma is elected through a proportional system. So here we have our best example in the globe of a proportional system where many parties are going to compete. It's not even necessarily candidates. And so when you get your ballot, you essentially vote for parties, and every party that gets votes will get seats as long as you get 7%. In other words, if you don't get at least 7% of the vote, then your votes get distributed to other parties. But if you get at least 7%, you figuratively will get 7% of the seats in the Duma. If you get 25%, you'll get 25% of seats. It's always a little bit different, but more or less that's the way it goes down. The pro-Putin United Russia Party currently dominates the Duma. They get the largest vote share in the election, so therefore they get the largest share of seats in the Duma. The Federation Council does things the way that we used to do it in the United States, which is that they are appointed from their regional district. And so it is an instrument of federalism in the United States before the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment. State legislatures get to use to choose their own senators. Now we elect them directly. Russia does it in a more of a traditional federal way, where regional governments get to appoint their federal councilmen. There's also a national referendum in Russia, just like we have in Great Britain, where citizens can approve or disapprove of measures proposed by the legislature. Political parties and elite recruitment. Interesting topic in Russia. And of course, for all those years during Soviet Russia, there was only one party that could legally exist, which was the Communist Party. But beginning at the end of the days of the Soviet Union, we started to see democratic factions competing with those communist parties and a few of the national groups in the autonomous ethnic republics. 1999, we see Unity emerge, which is the first party of power. And Putin would use this party as a vehicle to rise his power, along with his handling of the Chechen War, which shows you his disdain for some of those autonomous regions. In 2000, Boris Yeltsin, who was the president, resigns, and in a special election, Vladimir Putin got 53% of the vote. And in 2003, they renamed Unity and won 67% of the seats. So basically, this is the Putin party. And if you really want to have any kind of success, you need to roll with Putin these days. And United Russia has dominated ever since. In the last election, most recently, there's been some issues, but still very firmly entrenched. Elite recruitment in Russia, unlike other countries, means you don't necessarily come up through the legislature, you come up through Putin's network of allies, which mainly means coming through the state police or one of the other coercive channels. But you don't necessarily need to go through the Duma. In fact, that's uncommon in Russia. You need to be a little more on the executive side to reach the top levels of government. When we're talking about the bureaucracy, there's really only one entity that we need to mention, and that is the FSB, which is the state police. And this is probably the remnant of the old KGB from the Soviet era, which was really brutal and powerful and served as the spy network for the Soviet Union, kind of the Russian version of the CIA. These days, you do definitely have a remnant of the old KGB and the FSB. In fact, Vladimir Putin himself, as president, represents that old remnant of the KGB. These days, they are still doing intelligence. They are engaged in a lot of drug trafficking, counterterrorism, but most importantly, controlling information. And they kind of serve as the muscle of the Putin regime, doing any kind of the dirty work that is necessary to keep Putin in power and keep his enemies down, and that is true both domestically and internationally. The courts in Russia, the Constitutional Court is its name, and it provides judicial review of the institutions of government. Again, who is going to really go up against Putin in this measure? So, sometimes I'm sure they have symbolic throwaway votes that Putin will allow to make it look like they're legit, but they face immense political pressure, very low salaries, some have been murdered, just it goes to show that you don't confront the real power of the country, Putin. In fact, he weakened the court by moving it to St. Petersburg to kind of ostracize them from Moscow, where all the action is happening. We also have commercial courts that are going to hear civil cases or disputes between people. The procuracy are the prosecutors of Russia, and they are charged with fighting crime and the mafia and the drug traffickers and the prostitution, and also abuses in the bureaucracy. These people are really kind of up against it as the prosecutors. When they go after government, things can go badly. If they go after crime, they're usually left alone. Trial lawyers, on the other hand, are the defenders of the crooks, and they are often highly paid and very much celebrities in Russia, just like they kind of are in the United States as well. But this rule of law, the idea of a rule of law where everybody plays by the set of rules, there's an accepted way to try to change the law, it's just non-existent in Russia. It's always been very much a corrupt place. The police are corrupt, and the corruption overall in the government is pandemic in Russia, starting with Putin himself. At least half the population engaging in daily bribery, which is kind of their form of patron-client networks. You got to get things done. If you want to get through that road or keep your job or get your kid into a school or get your social benefits, you got to be ready to bribe. And that's how people make their voices get heard. And so, but that does lead to a very corrupt system. And then you got organized crime, which is driving out legitimate businesses and where you got to pay for protection and these kinds of things. That just really gets fouled up, and it's very much an old world system with modern bells and whistles, but it is still very much a corrupt system. In Russia, we have a corporatist system of interest groups. And that means that interest groups do not work on behalf of the people to influence the government, but instead are formed by the government and try to influence the people, try to indoctrinate the people. So we do have a lot of labor unions in Russia, kind of in the aftermath of the Soviet system, but they really are quite weak, whereas business groups try to gain insider positions with the state. So there's not a lot of democratic group theory going on here. It's not like citizens form these groups, and usually it's groups working downward to try to indoctrinate the people to think a certain way. Now we have other kinds of groups that are not pressure groups, but instead what we call the oligarchs. And so the oligarchs are a major player in Russia. So when the Soviet Union fell, these were the party elites at the top of the Communist Party, and they had the money and the inside information to get a leg up on privatization when communism and the command economy fell. So they gained control of the banks and all the main important economic sectors. They became millionaires and billionaires, and they've been very powerful ever since. And then Putin comes onto the scene, and and people in a democracy obviously always hate the rich people, and so Putin used this as a way to kind of go after them, to break them up using the police and the bureaucracy and the regulations. Um, but for Putin, he'll use the publicity game in order to grant himself more power over those sectors of the economy, and so it's a very dramatic and intricate political game being played. But oligarchs still very much very powerful and very influential in Russian politics. Let's talk about political culture now. Now, things are really interesting in Russia today because there's a lot of contradictory views on government. Remember, they've been, in the last 20 years, taking on a whirlwind as to how government should function and what it should do, and people have memories of the old Soviet system versus the 1990s attempts at creating a more of a democratic system to today where we're in this quasi-democratic system that's really more authoritarian under Putin. People will say that they favor democratic values, but they also love and reminisce about the traditional Russian strong, say, patrimonial strongman state going all the way back to the Tsarist days, and definitely including the Soviet Union and now Putin today. So it's kind of weird. Russians will tell you they like democracy, but they also like what Putin does. They reminisce about communism, but they don't want it back. 70% regret the breakup of the Soviet Union, but most will say we don't really want it back. And so you really can't have it both ways, but Russians, as always, being backwards, have figured out a way. You got to understand some of the historical events. Under Yeltsin in the 90s, democracy finally came along, and it ended up being all the things that people were indoctrinated to believe during the Soviet era, that democracy brings poverty, unemployment, organized crime, inequality, and all these things started happening. Really what it was the transition. It's a very difficult thing to accomplish, to go from communism to democracy. And and it was almost like the strong state people, the Putin types, said, look, everything we ever told you about democracy is coming true. And this kind of created a lot of confusion, and it became very jumbled in people's minds. And I think we're still in an era where people are trying to sort it out, if they're even trying. People don't have faith in the overall system, but they believe in Putin to reform it. So something like 51% believe the president should have a very firm hand, which speaks to the patrimonial traditions of Russia, where they've always had a strong leader. Only 44% believe in a president that strictly observes the Constitution. So, I mean, almost half the people think constitutionalism is kind of, take it or leave it kind of thing. As long as if you have a strongman president, then if we see results, then we're good. And that's why Putin has been able to stay in power for so long. Political socialization comes from definitely the government. We have a quasi-authoritarian system that is going to try to indoctrinate people, young people through the schools, older people through the media. It's constantly going to be pumping up Putin and the system and all the supposed successes of the system. And so that goes without saying. The Russian Orthodox Church does play a role. It does obviously provide kind of the sense of morality and what should happen in government and policy, but it also serves a unique function in promoting loyalty, patriotic loyalty. You're going to recall, in the Soviet days, the Russian Orthodox Church was basically subdued, and since the breakup, it has been allowed to exist and function. But the deal has been, we'll allow you to have monopoly on spiritualism in Russia, at least with Christians at least. And in exchange for that, we want you to make them pursue good citizenship, good behavior, and good morals. And so, again, you got a very blurred line between church and state in Russia, just like we saw in the United Kingdom, and quite different than what we see here in the United States, where we have a tradition of a separation of church and state. Political participation is quite low in Russia, and this makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Because of the patrimonialism, this idea that the government's going to take care of things. We like a strong man who gets things done. And Russians have always kind of believed that they don't really need to do much but live their lives and be part of the system and let other people make the decisions. Um, they do turn out in droves for elections, but participation in organizations is very low. So in other words, people don't get deeply involved. They'll show up and vote. It's not a sense of civic duty or political efficacy that makes them do it. It's their sense of the patriarch told me what to do, and so he says get out and vote, we're going to do it. Keeping in mind that elections are always pretty rigged under the Putin era. Only 9% belong to a civic group, 20% to a union, only 0.5% belong to a party. And it all speaks to the strongman tradition. And so therefore you take the next step and ask about the civil society. It's also weak and underdeveloped because people have, for a very long time in Russia, not really felt the sense of going out and doing things on their own. They've always expected and accepted government doing things on their behalf. With that said, we could identify some very strong elements of the civil society in Russia. Very long tradition of music and the arts and ballet. Some of the greatest novelists and poets and composers and dancers have all come from Russia. There are some clubs. There is some professional sports. Again, you go back to the Soviet era, and there was a very blurred line between all the Olympic athletes that were being trained very much as an expression of the state and the superiority of Russians over everybody else. So you can't really cite that too much. There are some private clubs and professional sports these days. But all in all, we see a relatively weak political culture and a weak civil society in Russia. And it's all because of the same thing, which is the strong state. The FSB is always watching the media. The media is free and independent, but it is heavily regulated and heavily intimidated by the FSB and other power channels acting on behalf of loyalty to the Putin government. Mentioned that already. Some sources of tension in Russia. Nationality is the major cleavage that we have because of these autonomous ethnic republics. And so Russians, or Slavic Russians, are the dominant nationality, and therefore they're going to have struggle with Muslim minorities and other ethnic groups that we have throughout Russia. Chechnya would be the region where you have the most tension, which has its connections to terrorism, and so therefore Putin, along with many other Russian leaders, have had their issues with Chechnya. There's also religious disputes between the Orthodox Christians and the Muslims. Muslims are a growing group in Russia, and so the traditional powers are resisting that, and so you've got some contention. So how did this whole Russian Revolution come about? The Bolsheviks were Russian communists, a growing party that sought to overthrow the Tsar, and in 1917, which they were very successful and did it relatively easily, and from there promoted a communist society, which they believe to be kind of the natural end to socialism, where if government is working to create an equal society of fairness, well, then the natural end would be just to relinquish private property and freedoms, because the government would be acting in your best faith to, from the get-go, create an equal and fair society. And this also meant that for that to happen, the traditional powers need to be eliminated, which is to say the church, capitalists, people who promote democracy, the czar, these kinds of things. And so they would say that you have to overthrow, number one, the capitalists, because they are the ones who are the power holders, and so the workers who are getting screwed by the capitalists need to overthrow them and take control of the means of production, and then naturally would be part of the government, and therefore create equality in the country, and then eventually that would spread to the world. It was very much a global revolution because If you didn't take over the world with communism, then everybody would flee to other places, and which kind of says a lot. If you're fearful of people fleeing the country, then maybe your system isn't the best. Although for 45 years they maintained it. Stalin further centralized the country after Lenin passed away, took over the country's industrial and military sectors, purged his opponents violently, and instituted 5-year plans on industry, collectivized all the farms, which led to the deaths of tens of millions of people, upwards maybe of 40 or 50 million people were killed. So far more of a murderous tirade than we ever saw in Nazi Germany. And so there's it's a whole story, a whole saga of Soviet Russia. But on the other end, in 1989, European satellite states that basically were countries that were ruled from Moscow through puppet regimes, they started getting overthrown by the people who were calling for democratic liberation. And after a while, Moscow stopped resisting these coups d'etats. And in the face of a weakened Communist Party, Soviet states began declaring themselves sovereign, like Latvia, Estonia, and Armenia. And then now you could see the domino effect happening. All this was possible because of Mikhail Gorbachev, who sought to make things more transparent, open up the Soviet Union to the rest of the world, restructure the system. All these things can be attributed to him, but in his moment where he really had to put it to the test, he let these satellites and republics become independent. And so as leader of the Communist Party, he basically allowed self-rule in some of these republics, sought this confederal solution. And then in 1991, the government fell, and Boris Yeltsin and the Russian Soviet, the Russian Council, took over. The Confederal government outlawed the Communist Party. Gorbachev resigned in 1991, and the country of Russia was born. So there's Gorbachev, as I mentioned before, Glasnost and Perestroika, which is the changes that happened at the end of the Soviet Union to open up the Soviet Union to the rest of the world and restructure its political and economic system, which is to say, be a little more democratic, a little more capitalist. And then, of course, what everybody predicted actually happened, which was, the top gets blown off, and then you have revolution, and then it's all over. That transition period is one thing we need to mention in the 90s. So Yeltsin is elected in June of 1991, and shortly thereafter is when Gorbachev resigned. Began to organize a privatization of the economy, which is to say, to take the means of production and the nationalized sectors of the economy, hand them back over to private hands. So they're becoming more capitalist. So when that happens, things go haywire. When you move from a command economy to a market that's dictated by supply and demand, things go screwy. And so prices skyrocket, opposition grows, and then you've got the beginning of a really dark stretch in the transition. Parliament refused to cooperate, and so they called on the people to seize the Kremlin, which is very reminiscent of what we saw in the Russian Revolution back in 1917. But the army puts down the uprising, and voters voted into a new constitution. That's the 1993 constitution, and they were able to get past that episode. But what was needed was what we now call shock therapy to kind of move along the transition because it had gotten stuck halfway. And so this basically means to get inflation under control, unemployment under control, to get the oligarchs out of the way that are impeding growth. And so government institutes these measures, mainly economic measures, to get their fiscal house in order, eliminate the price controls, reduce inflation by restricting the money supply, cut government spending. So lots of fiscal and monetary policy changes that are going to try to move along this transition into a democratic and capitalist system. So privatization is the last part of that. So here's how they did it. Because, I mean, think about it. There's no instruction manual on how to go from every asset in the country controlled by the state and try to exchange it to the hands of the public. And so privatization, they did this by basically giving out free coupons for people to buy stock. These $30 vouchers where everyone could go out, and they put all the companies that had been nationalized by the government and made them available for shares to be purchased by the public. And so by 1996, 90% of the firms had been privatized, but corruption was running wild, and you got to remember the oligarchs had their hands all over this. And then by 1998, the government defaulted on so many loans that the ruble was worthless, which led to 84% inflation. Long story short, it was very difficult to move from a command economy to a free market economy and to privatize all the sectors of the economy. And that made the 90s be a very difficult time for the Russian people. And then again, when Putin comes along and stabilizes things, that is what made people believe in him and has led to his being very much in power ever since. So what about the policy challenges that face Russia today? Number one, social policy, which is almost non-existent, is very much a problem. Public health is very dismal, and that goes all the way back to the Soviet period, where you have high mortality rates, mainly due to alcohol abuse. Life expectancy is somewhere around 59 for the average Russian person. Lots of murder, suicides, HIV, addictions. Russia's population is actually diminishing by 250,000. However often that happens, by 2050, its overall population may drop by a third. And that's a major cause for concern. You also got conflicts over the gay and lesbian community who are basically without rights and living secretly in Russia. Putin very much against these lifestyles, and so their demonstrations and protests are moving to the streets, moving into pop culture, and they're fighting for their rights in a more urgent manner. Monetary and fiscal policy, again, international investment in Russia is dropping, but under Putin it has stabilized and the economy has grown. But it does suffer from an overdependence on oil, which is the resource curse. We don't call them a rentier state because they have other sectors of the economy, but they do have an overdependence on oil. So in other words, when oil is good, Russia's good. When oil is bad, Russia's bad. And there are probably lots of other things contributing to Russia being bad on top of it. The budget is very skewed in Russia, and if I showed you the numbers, you would see lots of spending on police and defense, and lots of spending on administrative costs, which is to say paying government officials and all that, and almost nothing being spent on social policy or entitlements or anything like that, or any kind of development. And so then just their fiscal numbers are really screwed up, which leads to monetary issues in a very much a weak economy. Foreign policy-wise, this is where we need to be watching Russia over the next few years. Putin very much, make no mistake about it, rebuilding Russia into a global power. He invaded Georgia briefly and took over the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. And then more recently has developed an alliance with Iran and Syria in the Middle East, which has given them a foothold there, which is in direct opposition to the United States and their presence in the Middle East. And so in a way, we're seeing a resurgence of the Cold War chess games as both the United States and Russia are trying to have influence in the Middle East and other places around the globe, Eastern Europe. It's, eerily similar things are happening. It's still too early to tell long term if we are going to see another Cold War. But as it goes right now, Russia is very much a global player again, is acting aggressively. But with that said, still a lot of the same old problems that they've had in their backward society going back to the old Cold War era, the Soviet days. And so lots of question marks in the air for the future of Russia.